Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah. Yep. I didn't change anything. Testing, testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
If we had.
Yeah, yeah.
I see you called GAO engineering that, and I left my phone back here.
That door's open. You can go through. Thank you.
Right.
What's your name?
Kyle Kersey.
Kyle, nice to meet you. I'm Maggie.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, sorry, Larry.
Yeah? It's all right. Y'all don't look any worse for wear. Hey.
Mr. Chairman. Sir. Congratulations.
having us.
Hi. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Fawn off.
Oh, now you got it, good.
No problem.
Yeah, we got it. Like one posting not to work. It's always like this nerve-wracking, like typewriter. But I think I said that was all.
I just couldn't remember. Sorry. 4K.
Standing room? Interesting. There's a lot of topics to discuss.
Yeah, that's it. There's two different things going on here. So there's two different groups of people. How long have you been at GAO?
18 years now. Around there. I'm not in the Los Angeles field office.
Oh, so you've come in for this hearing? Oh my gosh. I hope you had no difficulties on your plane ride with the weather.
No problems, actually. Cool. Yeah. Most of that was the Midwest has problems.
So you flying back home tomorrow?
Tomorrow, yes.
Wow. What airline are you taking?
United. It's a contract carrier.
Okay. Are you able to get a non-stop with them?
Yeah. Out of Dulles.
Out of Dulles, yeah.
Andrew,
Hi.
Phil, Gates. I wanted to introduce myself. We worked together on a project, the GAO project, with cruise lines.
Yes. Yes,
I
absolutely.
just noticed your name and I was
Norwegian
like,
Cruise Lines,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
and the exemption.
Yeah, pleasure seeing you. Life's been good for you?
That's been okay.
Good. Good. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no
Yeah,
problem.
really nice to see you.
Yeah,
How are
it's-
things for you?
Good, staying pretty busy. Yeah, a lot of the maritime stuff.
Are you still with the same?
Yeah, K&L Gates. Yeah, give you a card. If you're ever in town, let's grab a cup of coffee or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
'Cause you were on the West Coast when we
Still am,
still are.
yeah.
Yeah, in LA.
In LA.
Cool. I'm headed that way for the holidays. My wife's family is in Irvine.
Oh yeah.
So,
That's where I went to school.
is that right?
There you go.
Yeah, cool.
Great.
Cool. It's a pleasure seeing you.
I'll do it all right. Sorry, y'all. It's yeah, that should be easy. Sometimes you gotta have it.
No, absolutely. It's often mispronounced.
Thank you for having me. How are you? Glad to be here. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Icebreaker now. Still an icebreaker.
Down. I might want to do that.
There we go. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Sorry we had to squeeze you all in here like this. Y'all are severely outnumbering Mr. Garamendi and myself.
But think about the opportunities next year.
That's, yeah.
A new reconditioned room.
I think you're certainly finding the silver
In the
lining.
meantime, we suffered.
Yeah. All right, today the subcommittee will hear testimony on 2 recent reports by the Government Accountability Office, GAO. GAO conducts reviews and audits to provide information for Congress to perform its oversight functions in order to improve the performance and accountability of the federal government. Today, we review reports that discuss the Coast Guard's Icebreaker acquisition program, the need for the Department of Transportation to release the National Maritime Strategy. The Coast Guard is in the process of procuring the first new heavy icebreakers in over 40 years. Icebreakers are essential for Coast Guard operations in the Arctic and the Antarctic. They're critical to maintaining U.S. interests in these regions. The 3 heavy polar icebreakers the Coast Guard says it needs are estimated to cost approximately $9.8 billion throughout their life cycle. In such an important and costly acquisition program, congressional oversight is absolutely needed to ensure the program is on time and on budget. However, GAO found that the estimates for the cost, schedule, and performance baselines for the Icebreaker acquisition program do not follow standard best practices. The National Academy of Science study expressed similar concerns last year. The subcommittee is particularly interested to learn if the Coast Guard intends to wisely complete design of the first polar icebreaker before beginning construction or to imprudently start construction while design work is going on. This subcommittee has been a strong supporter of the Icebreaker acquisition program, will continue to conduct oversight to ensure the program is a success. The second GAO report focuses on the need for the Department of Transportation to release the National Maritime Strategy. Congress required this strategy to be completed by 2015, but 3 years after that deadline, the Secretary still has not released it. The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019 extended that deadline for the Secretary to submit this strategy to February of 2020. This strategy is critical to addressing the challenges facing the U.S. flag fleet, including the potential shortage of U.S. mariners and the decreasing number of U.S. flag vessels. As a maritime nation, the U.S. needs to address these challenges now. I can assure you that I do understand firsthand the importance of having sufficient maritime assets to get U.S. forces and their supplies to where they need to be. I do thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing their testimony on all of these issues. I will now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes to make any opening statement that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to working with you, at least for some while, and then we'll see where the world takes us. By the way, we did a good piece of work yesterday, 2 days ago. Yeah. For the 3rd session in a row, the Coast Guard reauthorization was done in a timely way. And so for the staff, John and David, and for others that are involved in that, well done. And that's a... we ought to make it 4, and 5 and 6. Shall we make that our goal? And under your ranking, membership?
That's right.
And thank you for taking the chairmanship. I'm wandering, but I'm really happy with what's been done around here. So let me just go through this. For the Accountability Office, thank you. Coast Guard, Maritime Administration, thank you for being here. Thank you for your work. Bottom line, we're going to make these polar security cutters happen. That's going to take place, and it's going to take place on time, on budget, and that's our goal. Throughout this Congress, this subcommittee is focused on oversight of what the Coast Guard has done, and we intend to continue to do so. The acquisition program, a lot of progress has been made on acquisition programs. In this respect, there are significant acquisition programs that have risen to the level of importance within the Office of the Coast Guard to replace its aging fleet of polar icebreakers with a new generation of polar security cutters. New acronym, PSCs. Are we ready for that? Okay. Generally, collaboration within the Coast Guard Navy Integration Program Office appears to have enabled the successful development of solid requirements, produced a cost conscious iterative design and accelerated delivery time for the first of the 6 new PSCs. Of course, the GAO has raised concerns. It's their job to do so, especially that the IPO may have underestimated the risks. Moreover, the GAO contends that the IPO has been overly optimistic in its ability of the Congress to provide stable funding. Wrong. There's $7.2 billion in the defense budget. The defense of the Arctic cannot take place without a PSC. All it takes is $1 billion out of that $7.12 billion to complete this project. Am I clear about what at least this person intends to do? In addition, this CRS has noted that the PSC program could benefit from using different contracting methods, such as a block buy. I just told you how we can fund it, and a multi-year contracts, which I just told you how we can fund it, to increase the affordability and efficiency across the program. We're going to have a robust discussion about getting this done. Before Admiral Busby thinks I've forgotten about him, I want to learn from him where the Trump administration is. I would suggest that the committee, beginning the next year, subpoena the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Therein lies the problem. That's why we do not have Admiral Busby's report. It's stuck right there. And so, Mr. Mulvaney, the question is yours. Why we do not have this is in his hands. And we'll see. I have a written thing here. I'm going to run out of time very quickly, Tom, and I don't want you to admonish me about being long-winded. But there are things that can be done and must be done. We need that report. And I'm terribly impatient. So, we have the ready reserve fleet. We have other opportunities. We need to get at it. I'll yield back at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. Our witnesses today are Rear Admiral Mark H. Busby, Administrator of Maritime Administration, Rear Admiral Michael J. Haycock, Assistant Commandant for Acquisition and Chief Acquisition Officer for the Coast Guard, Ms. Marie Mack, Director of Acquisition and Sourcing Management at the Government Accountability Office, Mr. Andrew Van Ah, Director of Physical Infrastructure Issues at the Government Accountability Office, Mr. Ronald O'Rourke, Specialist in Naval Affairs at Congressional Research Service. I ask unanimous consent that our witness' full statement be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony for 5 minutes. Thank you all for taking the time to be here. Admiral Busby, you are recognized to give your statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Garamendi, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about the need for a national maritime strategy. In August of this year, the United States Government Accountability Office completed a report on maritime security, examining the role of U.S.-flagged commercial vessels in support of Department of Defense sealift needs. The report recommended that the Department of Transportation should complete a national strategy for sustaining the U.S. flag fleet, a recommendation with which the Department of Transportation fully concurs. The 2014 Coast Guard Act directed DOT to produce a strategy identifying which federal regulations and policies reduce the competitiveness of U.S. flag vessels in international trade. That strategy would also assess the impact of reduced cargo flow due to restrictions in the United States Armed Forces stationed overseas, as well as provide recommendations for making U.S. flag vessels more competitive in international trade. A comprehensive national maritime transportation strategy will serve the Maritime Administration's mission to foster, promote, and develop the U.S. maritime industry to meet the nation's economic and security needs. A critical part of this mission is ensuring the availability of U.S. ships and qualified merchant mariners to crew those ships to deploy military forces around the world to meet DoD sealift requirements. When the United States goes to war, 90% of DoD cargo is moved with the strategic sealift fleet consisting of government-owned ships and the commercial U.S. flagged fleet. The GAO report also reviewed the impact of the government's support for U.S. flag fleet on national defense needs and the challenges of sustaining the U.S. flag fleet for defense needs, as well as the status of the National Maritime Strategy. It concluded that while the U.S. government's support for commercial sea lift indeed helps meet national defense requirements, the rise in operating costs and a decline in government cargo volumes hamper the ability of U.S. flag commercial ships to compete in international trade. This has resulted in a decline in U.S. flag ships trading internationally and in the number of available jobs for U.S. merchant mariners, all of which compromises our nation's ability to crew government-owned reserve ships in a large-scale war or crisis. Finally, the GAO concluded that the lack of a coherent, comprehensive national maritime transportation strategy hinders effective policymaking on the complex issue of government support to the U.S. flag fleet. Given that the 18 federal agencies and the numerous other stakeholders are involved, MARAD is taking a careful step to ensure that all voices are heard. Since Congress directed MARAD to develop this comprehensive strategy, we have met extensively with the full spectrum of public and private stakeholders representing all maritime industry professions, sectors, and regions. The draft strategy was placed in interagency review under the prior administration. It was subsequently withdrawn by the current administration so they could have the opportunity to review, revise, and align the strategy accordingly. Congress recently passed the FY19 National Defense Authorization Act, which extended the deadline of this strategy to February 2020. We appreciate this extension, which will allow us to better align the National Maritime Strategy with the administration's National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy. MARAD is using the additional time afforded by Congress to further collaborate with stakeholders to refine the strategy's goals. I appreciate this subcommittee's interest in seeing the National Maritime Strategy completed and for your continued support of the U.S. Merchant Marine. I'm happy to respond to any questions you have, sir.
Thank you, Admiral Busby. Admiral Haycock, you're recognized for your statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Garamendi, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the Commandant and the U.S. Coast Guard, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to highlight our efforts to recapitalize a key component of the national fleet and acquire a new class of polar security cutters that will meet our mission requirements in the polar regions. I'd also like to extend our thanks and our appreciation for the hard work that you put into earlier this week when you passed the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2018. There's some provisions in there that will benefit us in our major acquisition programs. I would like to respectfully request that my written testimony be entered into record. The Coast Guard's current icebreaking fleet provides minimal capacity to carry out current icebreaking missions in the polar regions and does not facilitate uninhibited access or self-rescue. To ensure access and project sovereign presence in the high latitudes, the nation must take swift action to rebuild and enhance this national capability. The United States is an Arctic nation and an Antarctic principal with substantial political, national security, national resource, environment, and other interests in the polar regions. The Coast Guard and the nation need a fleet of polar security cutters that can not only break through the barriers and that stand in the way of our access to the polar regions and our areas of responsibility, but can also execute the full range of maritime security, safety, and stewardship missions once they arrive on site. As outlined by the Commandant, the Coast Guard is focused on a 6-3-1 approach to recapitalize the polar icebreaking fleet. That is 6 icebreakers, 3 of them with heavy-duty icebreaking capability, and 1 being needed immediately. The service plans to build these 6 icebreakers to provide multi-mission capability in the high latitudes. We're moving out on an accelerated program to provide these national assets quickly and as affordably as we can. And to that end, we established an integrated program office with the Navy to leverage each service's experience and lessons learned across similar shipbuilding programs. Over the past 2 years, we pursued a number of strategies to reduce program risk, including a comprehensive review and validation of operational requirements and an extensive industry study strategy with 5 U.S. shipyards to inform development of the system specification. This past March, we released a solicitation for detailed design and production of up to 3 polar security cutters. Source selection is ongoing, and we are on track to award a design to 1 U.S. shipyard this fiscal year. With the continued support of the administration and Congress, we are as close as we've ever been in the last 40 years to recapitalizing our old polar icebreaking fleet. I am pleased to testify alongside with Ms. Mack from GAO. The Coast Guard continues to benefit from our collaborative relationship with GAO, and the recent GAO report on the polar icebreaking program highlights the work by the Coast Guard and the Navy Integrated Program Office to mature the designs and technologies while setting realistic cost and schedule estimates. As noted in the report, the Integrated Program Office has complied with the Department of Homeland Security's acquisition directives and policies, and we have leveraged the Navy's expertise to develop an independent cost estimate to guide the acquisition decisions. DHS, the Coast Guard, and the Navy have concurred with each of the recommendations in the GAO report, and we are collectively moving forward to address each item along with the timeline noted in the Department's response letter. We understand the urgency expressed by the administration and Congress, and there's no doubt that we're operating on a challenging schedule to replace the nation's aging polar icebreaking fleet. However, we are confident that our acquisition approach and our risk reduction efforts will position the Integrated Program Office to deliver the first polar security cutter as soon as possible, and prudence demands that we continue investing in a modernized Coast Guard, and your support has helped us make the tremendous progress that we've achieved. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to your continued support of the men and women of the Coast Guard, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Admiral Haycock. Ms. Mack, you are recognized for your statement.
Good morning, Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Mayor Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the Coast Guard's acquisition of the Polar Security Cutter. In our report that we issued in September, we found that the Coast Guard has not yet established a sound business case for the program. A solid business case is achieved when there's a balance between the concept you're trying to build and the available resources you have to build it. The resources and the associated risks we covered in our report include design, technology maturity, cost, and schedule. We made several recommendations to address each of these key risk areas, all of which DHS and the Coast Guard agreed with and has already initiated efforts to address. With that said, 2 risk areas that I would like to highlight today are, first, the need to develop a realistic schedule that takes into account risks that are inherent to shipbuilding programs, particularly unique shipbuilding programs like the Polar Security Cutter. And second, the importance of understanding the maturity of key technologies before awarding the contract for detailed design of the cutter. Specifically with regards to schedule, in our review this summer, we noted that the Coast Guard's planned delivery dates were optimistic because it was not informed by a realistic assessment of shipbuilding activities. Instead, the schedule was driven by the potential gap in icebreaking capabilities once the Coast Guard's only operating heavy polar icebreaker, the Polar Star, reaches the end of its service life. Having visited the Polar Star this summer, I give much credit to the Coast Guard crew for doing everything possible to keep that cutter operational to resupply the McMurdo Station in Antarctica. While we all agree that with the Coast Guard that it is critical to proceed quickly as possible to replace the Polar Star, it has to be done with a realistic schedule. An overly optimistic schedule does not provide decision makers with reasonable timeframes of when the replacement cutters will be operational. This puts pressure on the Coast Guard to potentially take shortcuts, which in the long run can end up costing more time and money than taking the time to do things right the first time up front. Second, our work found that while the Coast Guard completed design studies, ice trials, and spoke to industry on key technologies, they did not systematically assess the maturity and risk associated with these technologies. Given that this type of icebreaker has not been built in the U.S. for over 4 decades, and that it has unique requirements to operate in extreme conditions, such as being able to traverse both poles year-round, we believe it is important to not underestimate the effort required to develop the cutter's technologies. The best way to do this is to address this is for an independent, objective group to assess the maturity of each technology, which then lays out the potential risks and allows the Coast Guard to put in place appropriate mitigation strategies. It is encouraging that DHS and the Coast Guard have already initiated efforts to address our concern in this risk area. especially since we have found that technologies often have a ripple effect on the overall design, cost, and schedule of an acquisition. Much of our prior acquisition shipbuilding work has found that lead ships routinely exceed cost and schedule targets and do not meet planned performance goals. This is because shipbuilding programs typically start with a weak business case. Specifically, these programs do not fully assess risk and have unrealistic cost, schedule, and performance goals. In line with our recommendations from the Icebreaker report, the Coast Guard needs to ensure that it has developed all the elements of a sound business case before making future investments. This is important for ensuring continuity between the aging legacy asset, the Polar Star, and the new Polar Security Cutter, so any additional capability gaps are minimized. Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Garamendi, members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I would be pleased to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mack. Mr. Vanna, you're recognized for give your statement.
Good morning, Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our recent report on costs and challenges to sustaining the U.S. flag fleet for military needs. DoD relies on ocean-going U.S. flag vessels, mostly those involved in international trade, for its sealift needs. However, it's long been recognized that the operating costs of U.S. flag vessels are higher than those of foreign flag vessels, and government support is therefore necessary to maintain the fleet. To help ensure the fleet is adequate for defense needs, the government supports selected vessels through the Maritime Security Program, which provides operators a stipend in exchange for agreeing to provide sealift support, and through cargo preference requirements that specify that federal agencies must transport certain percentages of international government cargo on U.S. flag vessels. Despite this support, the U.S. flag fleet in international trade has been in decline for many years, going from 199 vessels at the end of 1990 to just 82 vessels by the end of 2017. Recognizing this, Congress mandated in 2014 that DOT develop strategies related to the sustainability of the U.S. flag fleet. In our report, we noted that the Department had completed a draft strategy in 2016, but that it was subject to the new administration's review. At that time, officials told us that they viewed the existing draft strategy as pre-decisional and could provide no timeline for when they plan to move forward. We recommended DOT complete the strategy and establish timeframes for its issuance, and since then, the 2019 Defense Reauthorization Act set a new deadline of February 2020, which DOD plans to meet. Our report also identified two key challenges to sustaining the fleet for defense needs: maintaining the financial viability of operators under the U.S. flag, and ensuring a sufficient number of mariners to crew the reserve fleet during a military activation. With respect to maintaining financial viability, the additional cost of operating a U.S. flag vessel compared to a foreign flag vessel has continued to increase, while the volume of government cargo has fallen. These two trends have made it harder for vessel operators to remain viable. In 2016, as a response to these challenges, Congress increased the Maritime Security Stipend from $3.5 million to $5 million per vessel annually. Outside of increasing the stipend, officials and stakeholders cited a range of options as having potential to reduce the costs of operating a U.S. flag vessel, which would in turn make operators more competitive commercially and less dependent on government support. These options include looking at any additional costs of meeting Coast Guard requirements relative to international standards, options related to controlling or reducing crew costs, such as mariner income tax relief and liability insurance reform, and eliminating the ad valorem tax U.S. flag vessels must pay on the cost of maintenance performed in a foreign shipyard. Stakeholders also identified options to address the decline in government cargo. These options include increasing the percentage of government cargo that must be shipped on U.S. flag vessels, or requiring that certain export commodities such as oil or liquefied natural gas be carried on those vessels. However, at the time of our review, MARAD officials had not yet determined the potential of these options to address the underlying issues or the trade-offs involved. For example, increasing cargo preference requirements can result in additional cargo for certain U.S. flag vessels, but also result in higher shipping costs that can impact the mission of civilian agencies or reduce demand for certain exports. Turning to the second challenge, a MARAD working group has estimated a potential shortage of mariners in the case of a drawn-out military effort of about 1,800. However, there is some uncertainty around this number. The shortage may be understated if some of the available mariners are unwilling or unable to continue sailing during times of national emergency, as they are not required to crew the reserve fleet. On the other hand, additional mariners are listed in the Coast Guard's database as having unlimited credentials, but are not currently employed on ocean-going vessels. Their availability and continuing proficiency remains unknown, although we've recommended that MARAD take steps to study the availability of those mariners. Two options were identified by the working group to address the potential shortage. One was to create a mariner reserve program where the government would train them and help maintain their credentials, for which mariners would in turn be obligated to sail in the event of a defense need. and the other was to expand the U.S. flag fleet to support more mariner jobs. The working group did not analyze costs or trade-offs associated with these options, and instituting a Mariner Reserve program or expanding the fleet would require additional government financial support. Until the maritime strategy is in place that examines such costs and trade-offs and makes recommendations accordingly, decision makers will lack important information to make policy choices that consider all aspects of this complex issue. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to address any questions you or members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Garamendi, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to testify on icebreakers and the National Maritime Strategy. In my 34 years as a CRS naval analyst, I've covered Coast Guard ship acquisition for 20 years, the icebreaker program specifically for 10 years, and military sea lift ships for 28 years. There's been some discussion recently of how certain Coast Guard programs, including icebreakers, would not be affordable if the Coast Guard's procurement account in coming years were limited to about $1.1 billion per year. The notion that the account will be limited to that level, however, is no longer strongly supported by recent data on funding requests or enacted funding levels or projected future funding requests. More important, in relation to maintaining Congress's status as a co-equal branch of government, including the preservation and use of congressional powers and prerogatives, an analysis that assumes or predicts that future funding levels will resemble past funding levels can encourage an artificially narrow view of congressional options regarding future funding levels, which could deprive Congress of agency in the exercise of its constitutional power to set funding levels and determine the composition of federal spending. One of the most notable changes in the Icebreaker program over the last year has been the reduction in their estimated procurement cost. The cost had earlier been estimated informally at roughly $1 billion per ship, but the Coast Guard and Navy informed CRS and CBO in March that they now believe that 3 heavy polar icebreakers could be acquired for an average of about $700 million per ship. Reductions in the estimated procurement cost strengthen the business case for the program. A reduction to $700 million would strengthen it substantially. The baseline plan calls for acquiring the icebreakers using a contract with options. Contracts with options are not multi-year contracts. Instead, they operate more like annual contracts, and they cannot achieve the kinds of savings that are possible with multi-year contracts. Procuring 3 heavy icebreakers under a block-buy contract, which is a type of multi-year contract, might reduce their combined costs by upwards of $150 million. Last year's National Academy's report on icebreakers recommended that the Coast Guard use an acquisition strategy that includes block-buy contracting. Coast Guard officials have said they may procure the first icebreaker under a single ship contract and then use a block-buy contract for subsequent ships. In support of that possible approach, they've noted the risks involved in building a lead ship and the fact that the U.S. hasn't built a heavy polar icebreaker in more than 40 years. Supporters of including the first icebreaker in a block-buy contract could argue that block-buy contracting was invented to a large degree expressly to permit the lead ship to be included in the contract, and that the Navy has included lead ships in block-buy contracts in the Virginia-class submarine program and the John Lewis-class oiler program, and that the Navy is considering a block-buy contract that includes the lead ship for the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine program. The Columbia-class design is more complex than the icebreaker, and the U.S. hasn't produced a new class of ballistic missile submarine in more than 40 years. The cost of the new polar icebreakers might be further reduced by procuring both heavy and medium polar icebreakers to a common design, as recommended in the National Academy's report. This approach could save more than $100 million in design costs and millions more in production costs for each medium polar icebreaker. GAO has identified a risk of the first icebreaker being delivered later than currently scheduled. CRS agrees with that assessment. A late delivery could equate to an increase in the cost of building the ship. The government can insulate itself against that risk by using a fixed-price contract, which the Coast Guard and Navy plan to do. The possibility of a late delivery is something Congress may consider in connection with investments for maintaining the Polar Star and or seeking a short-term bridging charter of an existing icebreaker. The possibility of a late delivery could also become an argument for starting construction of the new icebreaker as soon as its design is brought to a high level of completion and the ship is otherwise ready to begin construction. Finally, regarding the National Maritime Strategy, I'll just pick out one of the points I make in my statement, which is that a recently acknowledged potential shortfall of Navy escorts for protecting sea lift ships in wartime could affect the willingness of civilian mariners to serve on those ships. If that were to happen, it could exacerbate the currently projected shortfall of available mariners. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be pleased to respond to any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes for questions, beginning with myself. Admiral Haycock, I want to begin with you. There's a statement we used in the Army all the time. I know the Coast Guard is familiar with it, and probably most others, and that's simply if you're failing to plan, you're planning to fail. And this is something that could very easily apply to both the design, build, and acquisition of polar cutters and any other vessel that we're working on. It can apply to National Maritime Strategy, certainly to everything that we're talking about today. And so I just want to ask this very, very bluntly. Are we going to be welding steel on an icebreaker before we have a completed plan?
So I understand that the phrase the Navy uses, and I'd like to assure you that we are planning, and we're planning to be successful. We put a lot of work into making this thing a success with the Integrated Program Office, the industry design studies, and so I'm confident we're going to have a design at a high level of maturity before we start cutting steel.
Perfect. Now, when we talk about this design isn't complete, are we talking about the hull length, the engines, or are we just talking about picking out the curtains? Give me an idea of where we're at on this.
So we conducted industry studies over the last year with 5 shipyards. Each of those shipyards has gone through the industry studies, identified risk areas, things like that, and then they've used that to inform their designers so they could submit designs as part of their proposals. Those proposals are in, and we're evaluating those. I think we'll find, I haven't actually myself seen those, but I think we're going to find that the designs are at a pretty good level of maturity for where we would expect them to be today. There are some details they're going to have to finish. We haven't started detailed design. That's the next stage of the design process. And so we have time to flesh out those details during that detailed design process.
It was mentioned by Mr. O'Rourke in his remarks, discussion of block buy. And I want to ask a little bit on that. Did the Coast Guard consider the committee's recommendation to use common design and block buy contracting with fixed price incentive fee contract to reduce the costs of acquiring the 4 heavy icebreakers? What was the conversation on that?
We've listened closely to the committee's recommendations, and I'd like to thank the committee for the authorization they put in the Coast Guard Authorization Act to give us those sorts of authorities for block buy, multi-year procurement, that sort of thing. We have considered all that for the Polar Icebreaker program. We have actually reached out to some of the industry teams during the studies to get some of their input on it as well.
I want to ask a question that it's just important for me as an American, as a soldier, as a member of Congress. Are our icebreakers going to be better than China and Russia's?
I would say yes. It depends on how you define better and what areas you're looking. But
you define it for me.
But we're going to have a multi-mission cutter that can conduct all Coast Guard missions and project our sovereignty and our presence in the Arctic. They will be, we're going to deliver it on time. It'll be on budget, and it will meet all of our needs up in the Arctic. We're convinced of that. We did spend a year validating all the requirements, and we know what those requirements are. We know what it's going to cost to do it. We've been able to bring the cost of the icebreaker down as a result of those studies. So I'm confident we're going to deliver an icebreaker that meets our nation's needs.
On time and on budget is always a tough one. But we are the United States of America. I think historically about things that we've done. I mean, the easy look back is World War II, what we did with ships and aircrafts and Sherman tanks and everything else that we needed to go out there and do that. What can we do to be helpful to make sure that we take that reputation that we've had before of being able to deliver on time, on budget, meet the needs of our coasties, our warfighters anywhere, meet those needs for national defense? What can we do to be helpful to you in this process?
Well, this committee has been very supportive of this effort from the beginning of time where I actually got started with the program. and your support has been vital to the tremendous progress we've made so far. We've taken some of the cues that you guys have given us. We stood up the Integrated Program Office. We've leveraged best practices from the Navy and Coast Guard prior acquisitions. I think probably the most important thing that would be of great assistance for us going forward is getting the funding in fiscal year 19 that we've requested for the Polar Icebreaker. The reason we need that funding is because we do have an aggressive schedule, as GAO has pointed out, and I think Mr. O'Rourke has also concurred with that the schedule is aggressive. But the only way we're going to meet that schedule is if we get the funding on time. If we don't, it puts the program at risk in terms of delivering the lead ship on time and its successors, its follow-on cutters as well. And so that funding support is important to do that. The other piece of that funding support that's of vital importance to us is it sends a signal. And so the support we've gotten from Congress and the administration over the last couple of years has made it clear to the nation and to the shipbuilding industry that the U.S. government is serious about national security in the polar regions, and that the government is serious about actually revitalizing the fleet by creating or building the new PSCs. If we don't get the funding that we need in our budget, in the 19 budget, that sends a signal to industry that the nation is second-guessing itself, and that it's not serious about security in the Arctic regions, and that we're not serious about building these ships. So your support in the past has been phenomenal, but your continued support in the future on this is of vital importance. Otherwise, this program is not going to deliver on time, on budget.
Thank you, Admiral Haycock. My time has expired. I will now recognize Mr. Garamendi for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It always comes down to money, doesn't it? And the problem is not the Coast Guard. It's not the shipyards. The problem are 435 members of Congress and 100 senators and a president. Let's just get very blunt with ourselves. We're either going to put the money up and build this system out, or we're not. And we've been dithering now for the 8 years that I've been around on this committee. Oh, we can't do it. We don't have the money, da-da-da-da. It's us. And by the way, the question is going to be resolved in the next 2 weeks. The Senate has the money in the appropriation, in their appropriation bill. The House does not. The House decided to spend $5 billion on a goddamn wall that won't do a thing to protect America. The Senate decided to spend the money, 1.2 on a security, which may be a wall, and an icebreaker. The problem is us. And we're either going to decide to build icebreakers or build a wall, and we're going to do it in the next 2 weeks. It's a choice. Make a choice. What do we want to do? We're going to forget about the polar, the Arctic Ocean? Oh, Russia is a problem. The National Defense Strategy says there are two major conflicts potential. One Russia, one China. Both China and Russia are moving ahead. And we're going to build a wall on the Mexican border to prevent, what, 5,000? An invasion. My God. The problem is us, folks. Plain and simple. The money is there. The question is, where are we going to spend it? I haven't even gotten to nuclear bombs yet. Ms. Mack, you laid it out. We're going to sit here and dither and wait, and then we're going to call Admiral Haycock or his successor in and pillar him or her about not getting the job done when we haven't given them the money or the direction. I'll go on and on about this, but I'm telling you, the money is there. The question is, where are we going to spend it? Now, moving on. The cost doesn't have to be $1 billion. I don't need $6 billion out of the defense budget. I only need $4.2 billion over the next 6 to 7 years to build these icebreakers. There's going to be a new team in town in January, but the problem exists in the next 2 weeks. Now, with regard to the issue of the maritime industry, all of the witnesses have said the same thing. It's all about cargo. Right? Is that right, Mr. Avon?
All of the operators would agree.
It's all about cargo. Is there any question, Mac, Rourke, Busby? So where do we get the cargo? Oh, yes. Well, there's a piece of legislation out there, mentioned by most of you, that we are going to be exporting oil and gas. Why don't we put it on American ships? Piece of legislation, by the way. Bipartisan, bicameral support for it. Not going to pass this year, but if it were to pass next year, we'd build 30 to 50 ships over the next 15 years, and we'd put the mariners on it. So we can do that without the government paying for it. But the oil and gas industry that's going to make a pile of money based upon one of our natural resources that the public owns, we could do that. It's all about choices, folks. And I think you know where I'm going to go on these issues. Now, with regard to the cost differential, and I'm going to wrap up in the next 42 seconds with this one. You suggest that it's more expensive to operate American ships. Have you taken into account in that analysis the subsidies, both direct and indirect, that are provided by our competitors?
Those are not included in that calculation.
I know that. That's why I asked the question. And therefore, the analysis is not valid. The analysis is not valid. Other countries are providing massive subsidies for their maritime industry, for the shipbuilding as well as for the operation. And we do some, but we don't come anywhere close. The next time you guys appear before any committee in which I happen to be sitting, I want to see that analysis. I don't want to see only half of the equation. I thank you for your direct answer to my question. And by the way, we really ought to subpoena Mulvaney. There is the reason why we do not have the report. It is hung up in OMB by Mulvaney's predecessor, or at least his operation, and the same two gnomes are sitting there on this report, as they have been for the last half-decade. And we're not going to get it out of there until we put heavy pressure on that system. I know it's not your problem, Mr. Busby, Admiral Busby. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. I gather you believe the 1980s don't want their foreign policy back, as President Obama quipped. The chair will now recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Would y'all turn your mics on? We want to all hear this, going back and forth. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Boy, lots of questions. In regard to the other countries that have icebreakers, I think this was alluded to. How many other countries? Is it just Russia and China? I guess this will be for you, Admiral, or the Rear Admiral. Is it just Russia and China that, in your opinion, we should be concerned with?
Russia and China are probably the biggest concerns up in the Arctic.
How many other countries in the world are you aware of have icebreakers?
The Scandinavian countries have icebreakers. I believe Australia has an icebreaker, and there may be some other countries in the Western Pacific that are working on icebreakers, like potentially South Korea.
Who has built the latest icebreaker?
I believe China's Shui Long is probably the last icebreaker that was built, to my knowledge.
And how long ago was that built?
That I'm not certain, Congressman.
Would it behoove us to check back into those processes and see who's built the last icebreaker and what improvements they made and how they did it and what the time was and any improvements? Is that something that's been considered, any of y'all?
Yes, sir. Yeah, our industry teams, actually our program office has gone over and visited some of the countries. South Korea is building an ice-capable LNG carrier, I believe. And so we've gone over there to take a look at some of the welding processes they've done. I know some of the industry teams have done the same. So we're not doing it in a vacuum. We are, looking at other countries and the technologies they bring to bear and things that they've learned, lessons learned. I believe the Icebreaker, the hull design, is largely leveraged off of some of the European work.
Okay. And one of you mentioned might have been you. Is it, do you pronounce your last name A or I? How do you pronounce your last name?
Vaughn.
Vaughn. I believe it was you, Mr. Vaughn. You mentioned, I think, small or medium or large, or was it you, Mr. O'Rourke, in your comments, icebreakers? Was it you?
Yes.
How many other countries have a medium and a large scale icebreaker? Do we know?
There are about 18 countries around the world that have icebreakers, and most of those icebreakers actually are medium and small icebreakers. It's only a small number of countries that operate what we refer to as the heavies, and that includes us and the Russians, essentially.
I wish you'd explain to me what's the advantage of having a small or smaller icebreaker or a large icebreaker. Wouldn't you want a ship capable of doing whatever needed to be done and not run afoul of a problem with a smaller ship? Does that?
Countries design icebreakers to meet their own national icebreaking needs, and many of these countries only need to operate icebreakers capable of
but I'm talking about
through.
for us. Why would we need a medium and a large icebreaker? Why not just build large icebreakers that can handle anything?
We have a mix of needs for icebreakers that includes both heavy icebreaking, especially for the McMurdo breakout mission in Antarctica, but there are occasions when you run into what we would refer to as medium ice, 4.5-foot ice, that can also occur in the Arctic. And I think the idea in building medium icebreakers is not to put excessive capacity in the ship because it drives up the ship's cost. What the National Academy's report said last year was they looked at the requirements for heavy and medium and they said, well, you know, the medium is going to be close enough in size to the heavy that the National Academy's report then concluded, why don't we just build a single class?
Are they half price, 2/3 price? Any idea? Cost comparison?
Well, actually, right now, our current medium polar icebreaker, the Healy, is larger than our two heavy polar icebreakers. It's about a 14 or 15,000 ton ship, whereas the two polar heavies are 13,000 ton ships. It has less icebreaking capability, but more capability for onboard science research support, and that tended to drive the size up.
And this may be for you, Admiral Busby. How many mariners on an icebreaker do we know, or is that for you, Admiral Haycock?
For commercial icebreakers or for military icebreakers?
Military icebreakers.
Coast Guard Cutter Polar Star has a crew of somewhere in around 150, I think.
Of 50?
150.
150. And yet we are training 1,800 mariners a year. Is that what I understand? Anybody from the 6 academies? Do we know that?
Sir, we graduate about 1,000 new graduates every year out of the Merchant Marine Academy.
1,000. How does that compare to the retirement rate?
Right now, there have not been too many retirements lately because of the status of the shipping industry. People are hanging in their jobs.
Okay. Well, I will agree with my colleague from California, Mr. Garamendi, that we need to be putting more money in it. Our academies need more support. We need more ships. I happen to have Texas A&M at Galveston Maritime Academy in my district, and they need a ship. I realize it's not an icebreaker, but I think, I don't want to speak from my friend from California, but I think he would agree that we've got to pay attention. We've got to educate more mariners, and we've got to fund this stuff. And I'm over my time, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Chair will now recognize Mr. Larson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've been here for 18 years, and this may be the closest we've been to getting any one new icebreaker. And then just about the time we do it, they change the name of it. So forgive me if I call it an icebreaker. It's habit. But the Admiral Haycock, with regards to the Authorization Act, which is hopefully headed to the President's desk, requires the Coast Guard to conduct an enhanced maintenance program on the Star to extend its service life. How does extending the service life of the Star impact your plans to deploy a new icebreaker, a new PSC?
So, as I know you're aware, we have only one heavy icebreaker in operation, that's Polar Star.
Yeah.
We put some resources into Polar Star back in the early 2010 timeframe to extend its service life, and we were able to extend the service life for about 7 to 10 years. And that would mean the end of our service life is about 2023. So we know that we need to invest in Polar Star so that we do not have a gap in icebreaking. And so we have a plan in place to do that. Our goal is to identify, and I think we've identified most of the systems that need to be addressed. And that was that's what's given us confidence in our cost estimate to do the work. But the goal is to do 3 phased availabilities to address those systems that need upgrades the most to extend its service life until we have a second Polar Security Cutter delivered.
Is any of that maintenance have to do with the actual structure of the ship, or is this all internal systems?
Most of this is internal. The structure is in fairly decent shape. Yeah. It's propulsion control systems and habitability sewage systems, things like that, that desperately need help to extend the service life.
Yeah. So what do you say to the GAO's conclusion from Ms. Mack with regards to the deployability of the new icebreaker being driven more by the capability gap as opposed to planning well for a new class of icebreakers?
I would concur with the GAO's assessment because it's true. The problem is we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The Polar Star is aging. It is one casualty away from not being able to conduct any of its missions. It is the systems are dated. Getting that ship underway and conducting its missions is hard on the crew. We are conducting maintenance availabilities that are very aggressive to keep that thing in operation so it can do its mission every single year. It doesn't have self-rescue capability. It doesn't have another ship to step in if problems occur. So basically, we were stuck with a really bad situation, right? If you take a look at the acquisition process and we hadn't done anything to accelerate, we wouldn't have been able to deliver a heavy polar icebreaker, a polar security cutter, until 2026 or maybe 2028. And so we've gone through in using things like the industry studies and the integrated program office. We've found ways to bring that back to 2023 to prevent that gap. It is an aggressive schedule, and we concur with that. But the nation's need for heavy polar icebreaker is not driven by our planning process. It is driven by the realities of the situation we're in. If we had started the process years before, if it had gotten the momentum and the support it needed years back, decades ago, we wouldn't be in this situation. But the nation's needs are varied, and it didn't compete well for priorities. And we have been blessed over the last several years that Congress and the administration have recognized the dire situation we're in and provide the support, and we've got great momentum as a result.
All right, thanks. We certainly have tried, at least over the last 18 years. I can vouch for that. Ms. Mack, I'll just go to your first conclusion about what the GAO found and the concern you had about design. And it seems that what you found about design makes sense. Did the DHS explain why they kind of have a backwards design policy, and they say they're going to look at it, evaluate it? Does evaluating it mean they're doing anything about it?
Yes, actually they are updating their policy. We just followed up earlier this week and expect that policy to be in place by the end of this year so that it will be more knowledge-based. All the components under DHS will have to do their preliminary design review before setting the baseline for cost, schedule, and performance. That'll make a lot more sense because you've got a lot more knowledge gained at that point. And like the Admiral said, that they agreed with our recommendations. We expect them to reevaluate cost, schedule, and performance after they get more information after a preliminary design review.
I look forward to it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Busby, one of the issues that's supposed to be addressed by the long-awaited National Maritime Strategy is the availability of mariners for our inland waterways as well as our international fleet. In Louisiana a few months ago, we had an elision between one of our major river crossings across the Mississippi River and a barge. Is this strategy going to fully address the availability of mariners and improve performance in safety measures? Is that going to be, those recommendations going to be contained in the ultimate strategy that's issued?
Short answer is yes, sir. You know, a grand part of the strategy is going to have to be our maritime workforce, both in numbers and in qualifications. So the training of that workforce, the qualification of that workforce, the sustainment of that workforce, both for the domestic fleet and for the international fleet, where you know, where I've testified where we have a shortage. Those are all key parts of the strategy, and will need to be a part of any strategy that we put forward.
What steps, this bridge was completely shut down for months. It was only recently opened one lane in each direction. It's going to continue to be under restricted access for a long period of time. In this case, there was a barge carrying a crane that hit the bridge. I mean, this is a simple math equation that shouldn't take a whole lot of calculations to figure out you couldn't make it. What steps can be taken in the interim to help improve the safety of mariners and transiting waterways in the United States?
Now, part of this really kind of crosses over to my colleague from the Coast Guard here. Obviously, we in the Maritime Administration were responsible for the overall training, the processes that result in trained mariners, both licensed and unlicensed. Work closely with the union schools and to produce unlicensed mariners and to upgrade continuing education for the licensed folks. We're subject to Coast Guard standard, which is in turn tied to an international standard for international voyages. But I don't know, perhaps Admiral Haycock could comment further.
I'll tell you what, I've got two more questions and I've got limited time. Let me jump back to my second with you. Section 3502 of the John McCain National Defense Authorization Act requires that the Secretary of Defense direct the vessels that are in the Ready Reserve Fleet that don't currently meet the safety of life at sea requirements, that those come into compliance. Can you tell me what steps have been taken to direct Ready Reserve Fleet or to come into compliance with 3502?
Primarily that has come down to covered or uncovered lifeboats, open lifeboats, and fire suppression. Right. So we are taking steps to upgrade those vessels, to correct those systems. We recently spent several $1 million to purchase new covered lifeboats and to upgrade those systems. Coast Guard is working closely with us on inspection regimes to make sure we're complying.
Thank you. Admiral Haycock, listening to the testimony, particularly it was Mr. O'Rourke who talked about bringing the vessel cost down for the polars from $1 billion down to $700 million, which certainly is laudable. The more we can bring the cost down, the better. And listening to him make recommendations on a block buy, you're talking about bringing costs down from initial estimate of $1 billion, if I understood you correctly, down to $550 million, because you said you thought there was an additional $150 million per copy in cost savings.
For all three.
Oh, for all three, so it'd be total cost savings. Okay, but even under that scenario, so you're talking about bringing it from initial estimate of $3 billion down to 2.1, and then you're talking about getting it down to 1.9, effective 1.85. This is insane. That here we are talking about, and I know I'm going to agree with you as much as it pains me. No, you're not kidding. Jeez, no. My friend from California is exactly right. So, I mean, this is crazy that we're talking about. I think that Ms. Mack went through in her testimony and laid out the concerns about how these strategies are going to dovetail. Here we have the star that's put together with bubblegum and duct tape. We have been operating on an acquisition strategy that is designed to dovetail. That should partially inform our schedule. It should. When do we need these vessels? But if we're forcing it in when we don't have the numbers, the certainty, the acquisition strategy in place, one of you mentioned some other interim strategies. This is very concerning. That as important as this capability is for the United States, whether it be for a mariner perspective or a defense perspective, we know what the other Arctic nations are doing. It's very concerning that we have so much uncertainty in this strategy and something that's so important to our nation. Could you just briefly respond to that? All the uncertainty in cost, the uncertainty in technology, the uncertainty in acquisition strategy, the uncertainty in dollars. Can you give us some comfort here that this actually makes sense and there's an interim strategy in place to ensure that we're not left without any polar capabilities?
Yes, sir. I'd be happy. So, actually, the programs, polar icebreaker in particular, are very complex, and there's a lot of moving parts. And we do our best to run those acquisitions to minimize risk and to deliver the risk needs to be delivered. Folks like the General Accountability Office, the Government Accountability Office come in and they do audits and they find things and we read their reports with great interest because there are ways to improve what we're doing. One of the driving principles on the polar security code, then the heavy polar icebreaker program, is utilizing state-of-the-market technology to the maximum extent possible. So we had a list of a bunch of things we used as guiding principles for the program manager to kind of control risk. And that was one of many. There are about 10 of them, right? So we wanted to use a technology that already exists. So we're not creating new stuff just for this icebreaker. We try to leverage existing design work as much as possible to reduce those risks. So could we have had a more proactive effort towards having a technology readiness assessment? We could have, and we intend to do that. But we're comfortable that the technical risk on the polar icebreaker program is bearable, it's reasonable, and it's under control.
Admiral, and Mr. Chairman, I just want to say for the record, I continue to have very strong concerns, and I know many of us have talked about this in this committee, about the interim strategy. What happens when we don't have a new heavy on board and the duct tape and bubble gum on the Star are falling apart? I'm very concerned about that. Also, I need to correct the record very quickly as I just hazed the captain of the barge for not being able to do math. I butchered it myself, 1.95. But again, going from $3 billion to 1.95, that just indicates an extraordinary level of uncertainty. Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Did you recently spend a month on a polar icebreaker? So just... There is interest in a second round of questioning, so I'm going to recognize Mr. Garamendi for another 5 minutes.
I'll try to avoid another rant here. I had the opportunity in August to visit a new medium icebreaker in Finland. They wanted to lease it to the United States. Unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case might be, it's a medium and doesn't serve the purposes that we have, and certainly doesn't meet the military requirements that all of our icebreakers or polar security cutters must have. So, but it's brand new. Had been commissioned less than a year, and so there is all the technology that would be used for a heavy icebreaker is known to exist. The application of that technology into the design, as I understand it, is well underway. Everything from the various propulsion systems and the like. So yes, we do know how to. We do know that it can be done, and it's done recently. It ultimately is going to come down to money here, and I'm making a plea to my colleagues here as we go into this issue of the omnibus. The question will be before us whether we move forward with a icebreaker or polar security, and call it what you want, polar security cutter. It is literally on the line now. If we do not fund, or do not accept the Senate version, which has $750 million in it for the first icebreaker, polar security cutter, this thing will be delayed and Ms. Mack will be correct. I want her to be really, really wrong. And it's up to us. And so I'm making this plea to all of us that we make this an issue to our various caucuses, to our various leadership, that it's now or this thing's going to get pushed back. And Mr. Graves' problem about the interim will happen. It will happen. The Polar Star is not going to survive much longer. We did pass a piece of legislation that is useful in forcing the Coast Guard to develop a strategy, but that strategy is dependent upon the steel and the vacuum tubes and other things that are in this ancient ship being able to be replaced, which maybe they can, maybe they can't. But there could very well be the problem that Mr. Graves cited. There's so many different pieces here. I want to thank the witnesses. You've laid it out. There's a serious issue on the mariners. We talked briefly about the brown water Navy or the brown water merchant system. The same thing applies on the blue water. We need to do that. Ultimately, it comes down to vessels. Are the vessels going to be available? We can make them available by adopting strategies. As I said, there's a, what shall we call it? Presently, we have a piece of legislation that would create opportunities, energizing the American Shipbuilding Act, H.R. 5893, of which some of us are on, and there's a Senate version of the same. And so it's not going to pass this year, but we ought to make that a priority for next year to address all the problems that have been appropriately laid out before us. Mr. Mast, I know you're going to hopefully stay with this committee, and if you're the ranking member, all to the better, and we'll see what happens on our side. But this is really, really important for every reason, and I'll let it go at that. Thank you for the opportunity to come back a second time.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. I'm going to recognize myself for a few more minutes here. I just had a question again for Admiral Haycock and also for Mr. O'Rourke, two separate issues here. But Admiral Haycock, if you could just discuss a little bit what kind of piggybacking goes on among the shipping industry, you name it, go wherever you want with it, in terms of going across those routes that are provided by our icebreakers. What kind of piggybacking would be put in jeopardy if the Star ceased to run or we didn't have that capability? What would we lose in terms of that?
So our polar icebreakers provide us, or will provide us, with year-round assured access to the Arctic regions, and that includes keeping shipping lanes open as necessary and providing national defense and that sort of thing. If we don't have the heavy polar icebreakers, then we have to rely on others to do that sort of thing. That's the Arctic is in Canada's backyard. They have an icebreaker fleet that they use, and Russia has a pretty good icebreaking fleet that they use. There are sea routes that go up in those areas, and if we don't have an icebreaker fleet to protect our sovereignty in the appropriate regions, then we kind of abdicate that responsibility to the other nations.
Who is piggybacking us, though? Because we want people piggybacking the United States of America, not piggybacking Russia or piggybacking China. Who's piggybacking us? What do we lose if we lose that capability?
I don't know that we have anybody piggybacking us because we only have one medium-duty icebreaker serving the Arctic and one heavy-duty icebreaker that's predominantly serving the Antarctic. So I don't know that we have anybody piggybacking us right now.
So the opportunity is for expansion in that world.
Yes.
So we're basically starting from zero.
Concur.
Very good. And so this, I said I had a second question. This goes for Admiral Haycock and also for Mr. O'Rourke. When we talk about this the idea of block buy, when we're cutting steel, the moment that we start cutting steel on a ship, does this end the window for a block buy? I mean, building a ship, it takes some period of time. How long out do we have that ability to go out there, in your opinion, and negotiate that idea of a block buy once we start cutting steel on a new vessel?
I don't know that the opportunity ever goes away until you get to the tail end of construction process. So if you have a large build sequence where you have a lot of ships, towards the tail end you kind of run out of room. So the sooner you execute in the process, the better it is. But we have time on some of our programs to do that. OPC, there's some opportunities there. FRC, we're getting towards the tail end. It might be a little late for FRC. We've tried to capitalize on some of the benefits of EOQ, economic order quantity, that you get from block buy through the use of the options in the FRC. It's not a perfect match, but at least we get some of the economies of scale there.
In general, the longer you wait, the smaller the potential savings you will realize out of a block buy contract. You can be in a situation where you're using a single ship contract or a contract with options, and then you can renegotiate it into a block buy contract. But if you wait until that point to renegotiate it, you will not capture as much savings as if you had done the block buy contract right from the outset.
Ms. Mack, by all means.
With regards to block buy, it's important to recognize it is just one tool in the toolbox, and it's not always appropriate in all circumstances. We've done a lot of Navy work that has used block buy, and we have not been able to prove in any instance where there have been savings, significant savings when they've used block buy. In the case of the Polar Security Cutter, it's really important to recognize that there's only, hopefully, at least 3. And the savings by purchasing in advance, if the design's not stable, if the funding's not stable, the Coast Guard could buy parts in advance, buy a big bulk of it, and have it there, and then the design changes, and they have to rebuy other parts because of the design change. So it's we are very cautious to recommend block buy until the lead ship is done at least, and then the design is stable. Then they could consider that.
Right. The Navy is very convinced that they have achieved savings in their uses of block buy and also in multi-year procurement. There's a counterfactual issue here. You can't run it the other way to show what it would have cost in reality. You can only compare it to an estimate of what these ships would have cost under single ship contracts or a contract with options. The Navy is convinced that they have achieved savings of the order of 4 to 5% on the Virginia-class block buy for the first 4 Virginia-class. They are also convinced that they are going to achieve savings on tens of millions of dollars per ship over the first 6 ships in the John Lewis-class oiler program. They're also interested in using it on the Columbia-class as part of their strategy for reducing the cost of that. Now, the savings that the Navy is estimating are against an estimate of what they think it would have cost if you had used single ship contracting. You can't run the experiment twice. So you get into a situation where, of course, you can't prove it because we can't do it both ways at once. But these are the estimates that the Navy has put out. They are convinced, and DOD has allowed the Navy to go ahead and do this on any number of programs in terms of both block buy and multi-year. Now, in terms of a lead ship, it's important to point out that multi-year procurement doesn't allow a lead ship because the law that regulates multi-year procurement establishes a requirement for design stability that effectively rules out using a lead ship. That's why block buy contracting was essentially invented by Congress. It was invented to a large degree expressly so that you could put a lead ship under the contract and capture a greater amount of savings. Now, as Ms. Mack pointed out, there are trade-offs that Congress has to take into account in committing to a block buy contract. The Congress has looked at those trade-offs repeatedly for Navy shipbuilding programs and has approved them repeatedly over the years. It's true that if you were to buy components up front under a block buy contract and it turns out that the design of those components is wrong because you wind up making a change in the design of the ship, that you could be left high and dry in terms of your investment. However, the Coast Guard's current schedule for building these icebreakers is to build them in rapid succession with one another. The second one is only supposed to follow the first by 18 months, and the third follows the second by 12 months. What that means is there's going to be a risk of transmitting design problems from one ship to the next, arguably, whether you use a block buy contract or not, because these ships are going to be built in rapid succession as a part of a strategy for getting a good learning curve on them. So it's not clear how much additional risk there is of this kind, of doing this under a block buy as opposed to a contract with options, because the risk really arises from the fact that the ships are close together to one another, perhaps more than it has to do with the contracting strategy.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. That was a fantastic explanation of that. Mr. Larson, did you require another round of questions?
Just a few questions. Thanks.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Ms. Mack, one of the findings from GAO had to do with technology and technology readiness assessment, which you note is not necessarily a matter of new technology, but perhaps it could be existing technology applied in a new way, or certainly existing technology applied on a new kind of ship. That certainly theoretically makes sense. Are there GAO examples where you have found that, and now you're applying that that lesson to this particular analysis, or is this a theory, only theory?
This is a typical finding that we found in a lot of our shipbuilding acquisition work. When the technology is not been demonstrated as mature, they end up having to be reworked later, or doing design concurrently, or doing testing concurrently, and then ultimately you end up, it's costing more and the schedule goes a little further. But as we mentioned earlier, the Coast Guard and DHS did concur with our recommendation. They are moving forward to do this technology readiness assessment because, yes, the technologies have been used in different vessels, in like the medium and other international icebreakers, but they're not in the same form, fit, and function that the Polar Security Cutter would be doing, and that's a bit unique. So we want that to be tested out in a standard type of process, which is in the technology readiness assessment process. And then also, it's important that although these key components are state of the market, a lot of times we've been shown in a lot of our past shipbuilding work, integration is always a big challenge. You haven't integrated them together. So again, doing that assessment doesn't get rid of the risk, it just lays it out so that the Coast Guard can be more aware of the risk and figure out mitigation strategies ahead of time. That's really what this assessment is for.
Yeah, and unfortunately, integration has been a problem, not just the Coast Guard, but with other shipbuilding activities.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes.
Admiral Busby, what options has MARAD, so I'm flipping issues here. What options has MARAD identified to reverse the decline in the size and the tonnage of the U.S. flag fleet in foreign trade? And of those options, have you assessed which are most viable?
Tough question, sir. As was pointed out by Ranking Member Garamendi, it really comes down to
I'm sorry, you got about a minute because I just got called to vote for the caucus.
It really comes down to cargo. Having more ships, I mean, we can all will and want to have more ships, but unless there's something for them to carry, you know, it's kind of a moot point. So things that we can do to get more cargo, I mean, he mentioned some of them, you know, taking advantage of some of the exports that we have. Automobiles as well. We export a lot of automobiles from this country. There's a lot of things, grain, agricultural items. We have to really, I think, take a serious look at, you know, what of those do we think make sense through cargo preference or bilaterals or whatever to share some of that cargo so that we can have justification for having more vessels to carry that. Same thing with government impaled cargo. You know, there's three pieces to maritime security program. It's the stipend that the government provides, it's government cargo, and it's commercial cargo. All of those have to be present for this to work.
We'll probably have some follow-up with you early in the next year, but thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. I appreciate it. There are no further questions, which I see none. I thank the witnesses for being here today and the members for their participation. I would ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers in writing to any questions that may be submitted to the Coast Guard, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by the members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good hearing, sir.